Kalorama, a recorded books high-bridge imprint, presents The Quiet Coup, Neoliberalism and the Looting of America, by Mehrsa Baradaran. Read by Seena Ghaznavi. Time catches up with kingdoms and crushes them, gets its teeth into doctrines and rends them. Time reveals the foundations on which any kingdom rests and eats at those foundations. And it destroys doctrines by proving them to be untrue. James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, 1963. Introduction. On the morning of November 8, 2018, the residents of Paradise, California awoke to sirens announcing an emergency evacuation order. It was already too late. The wildfire was out of control and spreading at a rate of 80 football fields a minute, closing off escape routes and melting asphalt faster than many of the town's elderly residents could leave their homes. One man abandoned his wheelchair and tried to crawl his way out of his house. Another elderly couple was found in their reclining chairs, holding their dogs and cats. The campfire raged for 17 days, destroying 3 communities and 1 million acres, and killing 84 people. Persistent droughts caused by climate change increased the threat of fire, but several investigations found that the catastrophic scale of the campfire could have been prevented had the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, PG&E, made simple repairs to its outdated equipment. Such repairs would have cost money and hurt the company's bottom line with no financial upside, because PG&E is a state monopoly and does not compete for its customers. Instead, California taxpayers, that is, PG&E customers, had to shoulder the costs of the fire, which was among the deadliest, most destructive wildfires California had ever experienced. Fires are often called acts of God in the anachronistic language of contract law, but a federal court exonerated God for the disaster and found PG&E criminally liable. The fire was ignited when winds knocked over a worn hook on a 72-year-old PG&E tower, which the company's own internal reports had flagged as dangerous due to severe wear. It was far from the first time the company's reckless disregard for customer safety had caused fires, since the state mandated PG&E to disclose its equipment failures in 2014. Over 1,500 fires were blamed on it. The company even faced criminal charges for 2 subsequent catastrophic failures, the 2019 Kincaid fire and the 2020 Zog fire, but avoided prosecution both times. As the campfire burned, a conservative activist in Georgia named Marjorie Taylor Greene took to Facebook to ask some questions. The post was soon dubbed the Jewish Space Laser Theory, and it marked the beginning of Greene's rapid trajectory from CrossFit enthusiast to right-wing gadfly to one of the most prominent congressional Republicans. Mimicking President Donald Trump's conspiratorial, just-asking-questions style, Greene's posts tied together coincidences and facts out of context to insinuate that a cabal of California Democrats and bankers intentionally set the fire for profit. Her evidence included recent swings in PG&E stock, which plummeted during the fires but was sent soaring again when the California Public Utilities Commission, CPUC, signaled that it would bail out the firm if necessary. For Greene, CPUC's announcement was just the latest breadcrumb in a trail that implicated not only PG&E and California state officials, but Senator Dianne Feinstein, the clean energy firm Solarin, and the Rothschilds, a Jewish banking family that once featured prominently in Nazi propaganda. Rather than state her views outright, Greene offered a series of coincidences, hinting that the fires may have been part of a larger plot. "There are all these people," she wrote, "who saw lasers or blue beams of light causing the fires," after admitting, "I don't know anything about that." She said that she did find it curious that PG&E had partnered with Solarin in 2009 to pursue space solar generation. The enabling technology has yet to be developed, and Solarin has certainly built nothing like a blue light beaming laser. The Post landed Green in the national spotlight. She was elected to Congress in 2020 after a campaign filled with even more incendiary accusations and hateful provocations, and her star kept rising. For several years, she has been one of the top 5 Republican fundraisers and is also head of the Congressional Freedom Caucus, which is one of the most powerful blocs in Congress as of this writing. While the money and fame reveal the nature of Green's hustle, there remains the problem of why there is such a large market for what she is selling. Green's scientific absurdity and crude anti-Semitism quickly became the stuff of comedy. The hashtag Jewish space lasers trended on Twitter, and the cast of Saturday Night Live mocked her. Less amused commentators noted that Green's insinuation of Rothschild collusion hinted that the story she was telling was much more sinister than one of quotidian corruption. They are right. The scapegoating of the Rothschilds may have been meaningless noise, an emanation from the internet's fever swamps, but what if it was the signal itself? Adolf Hitler began spewing his conspiratorial lies in 1919, and they were denounced. He was jailed twice for his provocations and ignored by serious politicians until a majority of Germans voted for the Nazi Party in 1933. What happened in the interim was economic crisis, inflation, and a growing resentment that the once great Germans were being taken advantage of by outsiders. There was some truth to the feeling. John Maynard Keynes, a young British Treasury official, had attended the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, when the British, French, and Americans met to determine Germany's war reparations. Instead of dealing fairly with the defeated Central Powers, Keynes explained, the Allies decided instead to take advantage of their defeated rival and take their pound of flesh in gold, which imposed a crushing debt on the German people. The Allied powers demanded 132 billion gold marks, $500 billion today, as restitution. It took Germany 92 years to pay the sum. The French proposed the scandalous deal, and President Woodrow Wilson faithfully decided to agree to the much more punitive proposal, allegedly because he worried about congressional approval. Keynes resigned from the British economic team in protest, calling Wilson the greatest fraud on earth. Keynes explained the problem in The Economic Consequences of the Peace, published in 1919, pleading, "If we aim at the impoverishment of Central Europe, vengeance, I dare say, will not limp." He explained that the reparations were unpayable and would lead to chaos, and explained also that markets were not separate from politics and peace had as much to do with interest rates as with government. His warnings of the consequences of imposing this unfair deal must have seemed hysterical. Nothing can then delay for very long the forces of reaction and the despairing convulsions of revolution, he wrote, before which the horrors of the later German war will fade into nothing, and which will destroy, whoever is victor, the civilization and the progress of our generation. Rampant inequality is a threat to any system of power, but most especially to democratic nations whose legitimacy is based on the consent of the governed. To insist on enforcement of property and contract rights while the state's legitimacy was under threat was to miss the full picture. It would be like showing up to a theater with a ticket and demanding to see the show while the theater was burning down. Or in real terms, it was like the European countries insisting that Germany pay full war reparations after World War I while ignoring the greater threat building inside the country, fascism. Perhaps the analogy is off the mark, and Green is just a political sideshow, but it is hubris to assume that the atrocities that befell Germany could not happen here. It can, and it is already happening. The seeds of hate that Green is constantly and recklessly spewing into the discourse have found fertile ground. Green may be a canary in the coal mine or a real threat, but she is a clear symptom of the deep resentment-fueled cynicism in which many regular Americans have been marinating. The discomforting truth is that if you look past the lies and the scapegoating, Green's post is about political corruption, about deep-pocketed special interests, influence peddling, and regulatory capture that led to the fires. The basic thesis of the message is that something smells fishy. Its emotion is moral outrage. Someone is cheating and it's not fair. Change the message to, some corporations are cheating and it's not fair, and it begins to harmonize with similar warnings from the left. But it is one thing to point out a corrupt system and quite another to begin naming names, blaming groups, and stoking resentments. Unfortunately, this phenomenon is not historically unusual. The fascist regimes of the 20th century were spawned in a petri dish of state corruption and weaponized xenophobia. Across the globe, the conspiratorial right has risen to prominence in countries as different as India, Brazil, and Sweden. In each of these nations and others, it has gained an audience by denouncing what is, in fact, a corrupt legal system. Rule of law is essential to a thriving market. Its absence is a harbinger of societal collapse. Yet the difference between a society where laws are generally followed and enforced and one where bribery, corruption, and violence are prevalent has much less to do with the laws on the books or their enforcement, and is much more likely to come down to whether people trust that the laws are being enforced fairly. The distinction is invisible to the naked eye, but it makes all the difference in the world. Trust is a subjective experience. It must be felt. And like its kin feelings of fairness and freedom, it cannot be papered over with meaningless words if a society isn't actually fair or free. A pervasive sense that a game is rigged will eventually destroy the game. Justice is a feeling, not a legal code. Faith in the just enforcement of laws is the Rubicon between order and chaos. And it is difficult to know how close any society is to the line where contracts and statutes are replaced by strongmen with guns. The United States has yet to cross this line, but one of the aims of this book is to convince the listener that we are close, and not because of the likes of Green and Trump. They are the symptoms, the misfiring antibodies to a growing rot, a cancer in the body politic that began decades ago and can be seen across our legal system if one knows where to look. This book tells the story of how an ideology called neoliberalism infected our politics, creating a complex and impenetrable network of laws and regulations that has created a system which is inherently unfair. Neoliberalism is an economic ideology that champions free markets as the sole guarantor of freedom and catalyst for prosperity while denouncing taxation and regulation as a threat to liberty. You may believe you've heard this story before. There have indeed been many brilliant books in recent years about the epochal changes to America's and indeed the world's political economy since the 1970s, covering everything from deindustrialization and financialization to the rise of pink-collar work and skyrocketing inequality and more, and sometimes all at once. This book tells a revisionist story of neoliberalism that takes the conversation away from the realm of economics and focuses instead on the law. We've missed the root causes, the primary actors, and much of the ongoing harms of neoliberalism because we haven't looked closely at the role of law in shaping our society. Free markets aren't actually free, as many people now understand. They, and the ideology that supports them, have to be built and maintained. The Quiet Coup tells the story of how that has happened in America and why it matters. Specifically, this book focuses on how neoliberal ideologies justified subtle yet profound changes to the laws and institutions that govern the market. Neoliberalism did not make markets more free and government less interventionist as promised. They made both more complex, opaque, and unfair. These laws are still being enforced, of course, and the justice system works to put fraudsters, insider traders, and criminals in jail following appropriate procedures. But the system itself has been so perforated with loopholes and bogged down by opaque procedures and legal complexity that it has become almost impossible for the law to discipline corporations. Put simply, the laws that shape the market are not fair, because they have been twisted to serve ends that are not our ends. This was no accident. The book will cover some of the key figures and milestones that shaped the course of legal change, weakening the legal system's power to regulate the market. It will only get worse if left unchecked, and the danger it poses to our democracy cannot be overstated. Corruption is a one-way ratchet that leads only to more corruption. The gap between justice and law is metastatic and can only grow until it destroys what little remains of public trust in our government. The 2018 campfire is a good example of the rot of corruption burrowed deep inside the regulatory bureaucracy, which should have had many people asking questions. PG&E is a state utility monopoly that is also a publicly traded company. Its legal mandate requires the firm to answer to the citizens of California, while its bottom line has a different master, the capital markets. Specifically, shareholders who expect maximum return on investment, ROI. PG&E was privatized in the 1990s alongside other state utilities during the heyday of neoliberalism, but while its profit model oriented it toward Wall Street, it retained its status as a state utility with a monopoly over most of California's major cities. This was typical of the neoliberal era, which promised one thing, free markets, but delivered its opposite, corruption and self-dealing. After facing criminal charges for deaths caused by their malfeasance, the company pled guilty to criminal negligence and was mandated to pay $3.5 million in fines, a drop in the bucket compared with its annual revenues of $200 billion, which is why the company's stock price soared. There would have been more fines, but the company promptly entered a Chapter 11 bankruptcy to head off future liabilities. Part of PG&E's 2020 reorganization plan included a hedge fund loan of around $38 billion, which will come from PG&E customer profits over time. According to the legal code, the hedge fund loan takes priority over all other claims and liabilities, which includes the cost of updating the utility's fire-prone infrastructure. After the company emerged from bankruptcy, it still did not update the faulty wires. Instead, PG&E chose the less costly alternative of shutting off power whenever its internal fire potential forecasts predicted a possible ignition risk. In 2019, more than 2 million Californians had their power shut off for up to several days during the course of the year, causing hardship for the elderly and disabled in high fire threat districts, which happen to be the most impoverished regions in the state. To remedy the situation, which Governor Gavin Newsom described as an unacceptable burden that no state in the 21st century should experience, the state budget included an additional $75 million to help the most vulnerable get help during the emergency shutoffs. In other words, California taxpayers stepped in to protect the people who fell out of PG&E's cost-benefit analysis, thereby granting PG&E shareholders another taxpayer subsidy to help the bottom line. These so-called public safety shutoffs effectively pass the cost and inconvenience of preventing fires from the tortious arsonists to the past and future victims of the ruinous fires. The point of bankruptcy, its spirit, is to offer flailing firms a second chance at survival by forgiving their debts. Yet, in a triumph of form over function, healthy corporations like PG&E and Purdue Pharma have taken advantage of the mercy offered by Chapter 11 protection to rid themselves of liabilities for their own malfeasance. For some businesses, filing for bankruptcy has become a routine maneuver enabling them to reorganize their firms by ridding themselves of unwanted liabilities, including employee pensions and legal liabilities stemming from their own wrongdoing. Even more troubling in the current state of the field is that companies have the freedom to choose a lenient jurisdiction and judge in a state far from their base of operations. All of Purdue Pharma's present and future liabilities for fostering the opiate pandemic were resolved in a small court in White Plains, New York, flanked by a handful of Wall Street lawyers. PG&E filed for bankruptcy after the Camp Fire fiasco, but it was the firm's second time through the process. It had also filed in 2001. Both times, Wall Street rewarded the company with surging stock prices and new investments after their liabilities were forgiven by the bankruptcy court. As part of its restructuring, PG&E handed 169 million shares of the company to a consortium of 20 hedge funds in an equity backstop deal, which resulted in $2 billion in earnings for those hedge funds. It was a win-win for PG&E and Wall Street, and the firm's CEO was rewarded with a pay raise. The fact that PG&E can finance itself on the market and enjoy monopoly status gives the firm the best of both worlds. The hitch is that the firm has a dedicated state utility regulator, the CPUC, overseeing its pricing and service requirements. The laws and rules that create the market are made not by legislatures, but by state or federal regulators who have specialized knowledge and experience. On the federal scale, Congress has delegated practically all its market governance authority to a group of regulatory bodies who have sole control over the industries they oversee. The regulatory state was created and authorized after the Great Depression to protect markets against malfeasance and excessive risk-taking. Since then, this government bureaucracy has grown in power, authority, and complexity. These agencies are invisible to average people and opaque even to the other branches of government on account of the complexity and scale of the regulatory state and the markets they govern. In the case of PG&E, the CPUC would have been the only legal entity that could have mandated the repairs. In fact, the agency's explicit mission is to protect the safety of customers and to serve the public interest. The problem is, as is common across the regulatory state, an overlap of personnel between PG&E executives and their regulators. The head of the CPUC at the time was a former PG&E executive, a fact that Marjorie Taylor Greene managed to get right among her insinuations of collusion. Even the federal district judge overseeing the case noted the regulator's lackluster safety remediation efforts after a 2010 fire, noting that it's a revolving door with PG&E over there. Investigations called the relationship too cozy, insinuating that the regulator may have been confused about whether it was protecting the people or PG&E. But these allegations do not violate the law, and in fact, the offended regulator and PG&E both forcefully denied the insinuation of wrongdoing in court, and the judge who dared point out the revolving door formally apologized for making an unprovable, in a court of law, allegation. State legislatures are another site of power that usually fly under the public's radar. And here it is important to note that PG&E is the largest political donor to California legislators. The firm's $10 million in lobbying funds to the state government should raise eyebrows for those concerned with democratic integrity. But for the bottom line, it's a no-brainer. Whether persuaded by donations or the revolving door, the CPUC did not force the upgrades and even issued a public statement promising to bail out the firm in the event of failure, which had the effect of reassuring markets and bolstering the stock price. The CPUC also generously waived $200 million in fees and fines it had levied for the malfeasance in order to help the firm after its stock plummeted. Even as it proceeded through the bankruptcy process, PG&E continued to spend millions on lobbying aimed at supporting policies friendly to its business model. As far as PG&E's shareholders are concerned, spending money on lobbying yields the highest ROI. Nothing else comes close. Although PG&E executives and shareholders are rewarded according to the terms of the competitive market, the firm has no market competition. Its customers include all of California's residents who have no other option but to use PG&E. Is it any wonder an average American unfamiliar with the legal intricacies of the law might feel that something untoward is going on? What can a frustrated PG&E customer do but throw up their hands and vote the bastards out, as Greene urged? What to do with the pent-up rage and frustration born of powerlessness against untouchable megacorporations that run our lives? It is this feeling that fuels the resentment which Green and Trump have taken advantage of, and that will only grow until it is addressed. The unseen currency of the complex market system is trust. The invisible hand is our democratic order, we the people, our fair and just legal order, and our democracy ensuring equal access to all, regardless of wealth. It is the spirit of the law whose absence is felt before it can be proved. When the fruits of the legal system are blatantly unfair, it is evident that the rot lies at the roots, and Americans are catching on. One victim of the fire, who has been living in a trailer since losing her home, said of the revelations of the hedge fund sales, "I have zero doubt that Wall Street was behind this. The justice system thoroughly failed the survivors of these fires. They thoroughly failed us. That's a fact." It bears repeating that there were no conspiracies of the space laser variety behind the 2018 Camp Fire. The dots connected to something much more banal and insidious. Each entity did what it was incentivized to do. PG&E prioritized shareholder returns, the state legislators traded favorable treatment for donations, and investors skimmed more profits from public funds. It was just one instance among myriad others that have come to define the American economy. Nor is this an issue of left versus right, but rather decades of change to the legal bureaucracy, sometimes called the regulatory or administrative state, that makes and enforces market rules. The revolving door between PG&E and its regulator, the direct line between lobbying funds and legal decision-making, and the complexity of the entire regulatory infrastructure have created a situation where market laws resemble a game board, accessible only to those who know how to play. In other words, it was all perfectly legal and above board. PG&E followed industry standards, technical procedures, and best practices to a T. But legal is not the same thing as fair. And the underlying unfairness, the sense that something is wrong in the system, resonates with many Americans. Although it is hardly unique, the PG&E saga is emblematic of the larger threats to our legal system. To many Americans, the game is rigged against the average person and in favor of a powerful, unseen force. YouTube videos and viral news stories promise to expose the plot to destroy America. They blame the deep state, Russian operatives, pedophile rings, social justice warriors, immigrants, terrorists, Chinese scientists, globalists, drug companies, the Fed, George Soros, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, cultural Marxism, critical race theory, Anthony Fauci, and others. Protesters accuse school boards of racial indoctrination. Patriots attack the Capitol to save America from traitors, and many denounce vaccines and masks as state tyranny. The viral success of these conspiracy theories is not just a consequence of shameless politicians or of social media algorithms that have hooked us on sensationalism and lunacy. The declining trust in long-standing American institutions plays a role too, as does the notable disappearance of the so-called American dream, which promised success based on individual effort. We now wonder why college graduates are unable to achieve financial security like their parents or grandparents did. Why do pundits and politicians keep saying that the economy is doing great while the majority of Americans can barely make ends meet? Where have all the good jobs gone and who has taken them? Why has the top 1%'s net worth increased by $21 trillion over the last 10 years, while the bottom 50% has lost $900 billion? Why are so many families paying student debt for 2 generations at once? Why don't bankers go to jail in a nation that still locks up low-level minority offenders at the highest rates in the world? And why do so many politicians keep voting for policies that enrich a minority of wealthy Americans? In fact, the game is rigged toward the powerful, though not at all in the way the conspiracy mongers think. Indeed, many of the people who
Sample complete. Ready to continue?